Bethany, I wanted to ask you, let's talk some more about the stigma associated with schizophrenia. We've talked about how it is seen as this hopeless, you've used the term death sentence. What do you think goes into making schizophrenia such a stigmatizing concept or naughty word?
Well, first of all, people don't really understand what schizophrenia is. Again, we're looking at a treatable brain disease. We're not looking at a group of people who are exceptionally violent or people who are not ordinary people who are different than us. So there are a lot of myths concerning schizophrenia. Another myth is that it's associated with a split mind. Schizophrenia is from the Greek, it means split mind. But it was named wrongly, really, in 1908. Today we know much, much more about schizophrenia, what's happening inside of the brain during a psychotic episode. And especially for people who get treatment early, there's a lot of hope. The myth is that if you have schizophrenia, you'll never have an ordinary life. You're not going to go back to school and graduate and work and have a family. But today, many people with schizophrenia do have great success at school, have family life, work, jobs successfully. So a lot of myths surrounding this brain disease. And often people with schizophrenia they become the scapegoat. You hear of about a violent crime online, and people question, was this from schizophrenia? So big lack of education, lack of understanding.
You mentioned the word itself, schizophrenia, coming from very old concepts of splitting of the mind. Are you familiar with how they've renamed this condition in Japan to integration
disorder? Yes, I am.
I think that's brilliant because it actually gets closer to what's really going on with this entity we call schizophrenia. A lot of what our brain does is our brain constructs what I call a virtual map or a virtual reality of the external world. And that involves a lot of integration of sensory information. Visual information, auditory information, information about the position of one's body in space and the workings of the body inside, how much oxygen you have in your blood or what the pressure is. The brain gets all this information and it has to construct a little map of what's going on so that we, who are both operating and operated by its brain, are able to know what to do next. And if you have so much information to integrate into one picture, and you have to do that every millisecond of awareness, a lot of opportunities for error exist in that system. So I think calling it integration disorder was brilliant because what we call psychosis actually is nothing more than errors in the final processing of information to get this virtual map.
What is real, what is not real.
Yeah, some people have actually gone so far to say, and I think it's a valid analogy, that we're all hallucinating. In other words, we're all constructing this internal map of an external world, and when our internal maps agree, we call that reality. But when we process something different, that's called hallucination. But in the end, it's all, if you will, a virtual reality that we live in.
I think that part of the reason schizophrenia is so stigmatized is people can't imagine how it feels to have a hallucination, to have a delusion. It sounds so bizarre.
Well, the funny thing that you say that is because even though we think that hallucinations or delusions are very rare, the data suggests that nearly 1 in 10 Americans has had some facet of psychosis during their life or will have. So I call it the most common problem that nobody talks about.
What kinds of hallucinations would those be?
The data that I'm familiar with didn't get into the nitty-gritty, but auditory hallucinations are the easiest. Auditory hallucinations are the easiest way to have hallucinations. So I would expect that of those who have hallucination-like experience, that it's likely to be an auditory factor. Probably the next most common form of hallucination are tactile hallucinations, feeling of odd sensations on the skin or from within the body. I think as well that personally, I think that schizophrenia also gets a bad reputation because we named this condition more than 100 years ago when we had no ability to treat this condition.
Yeah.
So the
death sentence.
initial treatment was put the person in a long-term hospital or facility where they're disconnected from their family, from job prospects, and so forth. And of course, people get worse in that scenario.
Yes.
We discovered some medicine which was effective.
Chlorpromazine.
Chlorpromazine was the first of the antipsychotic medications. I call them so-called antipsychotic because they actually do a whole lot of other things. You can, for example, treat nausea with these medicines, and there can be other beneficial uses from blocking the signal of dopamine, which is what these medicines ultimately do.
Yeah.
But when we developed the first of these medicines, the field, tended to use them at doses which were extreme, and eventually tended to massively over-rely on medicines rather than addressing other aspects of life, as you mentioned, how to get on with one's life, or how to sort of reassemble the pieces in order to get back into school or to work in relationships. So historically, we focused just on the medicine, which was over-relied upon and overdosed,
Very much
so that we
overdosed.
gave people a bunch of side effects without a whole lot of additional hope. And that's a poor way to make somebody better. So we've had, that would be round two of making mistakes on schizophrenia benefits. And then, if you will, the third generation of schizophrenia treatment moved people out of the longer-term care facilities into the community.
Yeah.
On the surface, it was a good idea to move them out of these longer-term facilities, which had, in many cases, become like warehouses. And the idea was to provide them with support where they live and help them to get on with assembling a life and so forth. But unfortunately, the money never followed the dream. So then you had, if you will, the worst of all worlds, where you have people in the full-on society without the supports to manage it.
Living on the streets.
And then over-relying on medicines on top of that. So we've done, I'd say, 3 rounds of doing things badly. So I understand how people think it's a catastrophic condition, but I think largely that's been on us.